In this lesson, we're going to discuss single point perspective. Single point perspective is really important to understand from a design perspective because it seeks to express the quality of a space. And that quality is not necessarily represented that easily in orthographic drawings. Remember that orthographics are drawings that really help to identify proportion, measurements, sort of assembly, but perspective helps us understand that emotional quality of space or how we can perceive being within that space. And that should really be the focus of our expression when it comes to architecture, right? Architecture is not just, four walls on a roof, but it should seek to elicit some kind of an emotional response, remembering that architecture has an affect quality on the user, okay? So with that, we're going to look at Emmanuel DeWitt's Interior with a Woman at the Virginals. This was painted in 1660. And when we think about how painters, starting in the Renaissance and today, this is a technique that is very important for artists to understand, but is equally for architects, because renderings in perspective are something that we can make, okay? They're not just something that we make a model of and we take a screenshot, but we should really be thinking about how we compose that and what that means with respect to space. And so doing this assignment, you're going to find that you're actually going to become better at representing architecture, because I'm going to show you the formal technique of measuring space in perspective from a floor plan. But before we get into that, we need to just unpack some of the necessities that make a single point perspective. So what's important to remember is a perspective always has a horizon line, okay? And that horizon line actually exists at eye level. So if we just understand where the painter is painting with respect to the people within, there's this horizontal line that passes through the eyes, okay? Now, when there are scale figures on the same plane as the viewer, the eyes of the scale figure will always intersect with that horizon line, okay? And that's true of depending on how close and how far they are, but the eyes will always pass through the horizon line. So that's very important to remember, okay? Now, the next thing we need to look at is establishing what is called a vanishing point. In single point perspective, there will always be a singular vanishing point, okay? So we're just gonna draw a dot here. And we know that this is the vanishing point of the painting because if we identify where all of these lines, as you can see, that are in perspective, they will all intersect at the vanishing point. Now, let's establish some of the axes first, okay? So when we think about single point perspective, remember that everything in the x-axis will always exist horizontal, okay? So all horizontal lines will always be exactly horizontal. Now we can identify that. I'm just going to copy this line up a little bit. Let me just make this line a little bit heavier so that we can see. Okay, but we can see that all of these horizontal lines are horizontal. All right, and that's same with the picture frame up here, with the crown molding, and so on and so forth, right? The other thing that is important to remember is all vertical lines, so all lines in the z-axis are vertical lines as well, okay? So I'm just going to draw a series of lines here and show you how all of those vertical lines will always be vertical. So the lines that change are the lines that exist along the y-axis or with respect to the vanishing point, okay? Everything that's in relation to the image that's getting farther and farther away, that line is the y-axis, and I'm going to show you how we can measure that and display their distances with respect to space, so that none of this is really arbitrary. But I'm going to take you over to an orthographic drawing and just show you that process, okay? So now that we have our orthographic drawings, we are going to establish our perspective. Note how here I said section perspective. So we're actually going to take this section that I've drawn, and you can see it's pretty basic, right? It's taken from this point here. So this is where we're sectioning this plan. And it doesn't really tell us too much. It gives us this, we'll talk a little bit about this valence here, but you can see that this is that dashed line. So remember that in an orthographic drawing, anything that's dashed in represents any geometry that is behind the field of view or the picture plane, okay? Now, that's what this is about here. And you'll see that there's a little bit more something here in the middle of the room. We're going to have to establish that as well. And we're going to want to figure out how to represent this door and sort of all these sort of windows, these little sliver windows that I've put in. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is we need to establish a vanishing point, okay? And that's going to be right here. So let's establish a vanishing point, and that's going to also it's going to establish our horizon line. And the next is that vanishing point will exist directly above as projected orthographically from our station point here. Okay, so there's the station point. The next thing we need to do is, based on our station point, we will need to understand our sort of the geometry with reference to our picture plane. Okay, and we are going to create a distance point, and this is 45 degrees. This is projected 45 degrees from our station point up to our distance point. All right, so doing that, we should be able to build off of our perspective. Okay, now let's begin. So once we have these few things here, what is going to be important is to just go slow. Remember that everything in the Y direction, that's everything that sort of follows this dashed line up, that is going to vanish to our vanishing point. Everything along the X axis will be a horizontal line. Everything that is along the Z axis will be a vertical line up here. Okay. So as we do this, let's just talk a little bit about door heights, right? Typical door height is about 7 feet. And one of the ways that I establish a door height along this line is I will use my orthographic drawing. And so you can use the Z axis to establish things as they exist, and we can just draw lines in. So if our line, and you can see I'm in millimeters, so I'm just going to guess where my door height is, but you should be measuring this. But let's just assume that 7 feet is probably somewhere around here, okay? And we know that the door height is going to vanish toward the vanishing point here, so I'm just going to draw that line in as a construction line, okay? So the next thing that I also like to do is I like to go with a line here. Now, my door height, or my ceiling height is probably somewhere around it's a generous ceiling height of probably about 14 feet or so. So don't be alarmed that my ceiling height might be a little bit higher than yours, but if you have double height spaces, it might look a little similar to this, okay? So I'm just gonna go ahead and establish sort of my ceiling height there, my floor plane along that axis, and my floor plane along here. I'm just going to go ahead and hide this annotation here, just so it doesn't muddy up our drawing. Same with this. We kind of get the idea. You can always, back up and reference that. Now for this drop-down volume here, this also is going to vanish toward our vanishing point. And this line here, which is going to represent the upper sort of bit of that valence light, that's going to vanish too. I'm just going to draw that wild. And you'll just see that if I trim that wild line out, that's going to be that little bit that happens up there, okay? So now, knowing that we have door height, we have our ceiling height, our floor, and we know that the back wall is going to exist somewhere in here. There's a door somewhere along here. We've already established this valence light, and that's really all we need to sort of establish here. There's going to be a drop down in the ceiling somewhere, and we'll get to that shortly, not to worry. But let's start mapping these things out. So what we do is, given that we have our picture plane here and our ground line, what we need to do is we're going to use this this distance point and the horizon line, and I'll just show you how we can start to map things out. So let's just start with this corner here. Let's draw this back, and I always remember to go 45 degrees away from our distance point. That's going to give us our reference there. So I'm just going to draw this and where it intersects with our picture plane here. Okay, that's step one. Then the next step is to draw a vertical line straight up to our ground line. Okay. And then from here, we draw over to our distance point, and that establishes where those two lines meet, establishes where that door is. Okay, and I'll just show you here. Now we can draw a vertical line, excuse me. We'll draw a vertical line straight up, and that's going to intersect with the top of the door right here. So let's do this one more time. Let's establish the back side. Okay, so we're going to draw from here. We're going to go 45 degrees down to this line. And now straight up, we're going to project straight up to our ground line. And over to our distance point. And where that intersects with this line here, that's going to be that door. Okay. Now I'm just going to go over that just to sort of solidify. It's really important to start off very light when you're hand drafting, and then slowly add your line weights. But I'm just going to go ahead and make that nice and heavy just to show you. And remember that this line here, I'm just going to keep that nice and horizontal just to show you that the base of this corridor here is going to be a horizontal line. Okay, and I'm just going to use this curve just to trim that excess out. Boom, there we go. Okay, and I'll just solidify that a little bit more too, just so you can kind of see that. Okay, so there we go. We've got the door figured out. Okay, now the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to try to figure out where this exists. Okay, and where it exists on this this plane here. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly draw those projection lines because we know that it exists somewhere around here, right? If we imagine that this comes straight back to our section cut, it's going to start here, and then it's going to exist somewhere along this y-axis that vanishes toward that vanishing line. So what's important to remember here is everything along this wall really wants to be, you know, its place within space wants to be sort of relative to this wall, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this, I'm going to come over and find where it intersects with that wall, because we're going to use the wall to find out. We're going to project over. So maybe that'll make a little bit more sense in a second here. But we're going to come back on our 45. And we're going to come straight up, just like we've done, and come over to our distance point. And you can see that the distance away from the door frame is actually very small. But we're going to come straight up to the top here. Try to get rid of that. There we go. So along the ceiling with respect to the wall, that's where this point is. All right. And now I'm going to draw this over here. So that represents this corner here. So let's do that one more time. Let's come back over, and you can see that it's actually going to intersect here. All right. Straight up to the ground line, and then to the distance point. And that there's not a lot of margin of error here. You know, it's very difficult to see, but I think if we'll just trust the program to do it here. There. So now we've got these 2 points. Now it's just a case of connecting the dots. Okay, so now we've got that line. I'll just sort of solidify that for you all to see. So that's where that skylight is sitting with respect to the wall here. Okay, so then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to find the end of the room. Okay, so we're going to come back to our picture plane, project upwards to our ground line, to our distance point, straight up. Okay, and same with this one here. We're going to just do the exact same thing. I'm going to have to just project over a little bit more. Just trying to get my snaps to work properly here. There we go. All right, and then straight up. Okay. And there we go. So now I can sort of solidify that a little bit more. I'll just draw that rectangle in, and that represents that back wall. Okay, and we can continue to do that with every single one of these corners here. Excuse me, sometimes my smart track is not going to work. There we go. So now you can see that it's going to be important for me to start to clean things up here. Okay, so I'm going to just get rid of some of those lines and keep going. So you might have to erase some of your lines too. Okay, so now where that intersects, you can see it's going to be a tiny little sliver here. All right. And I'll probably have to zoom in, but now you can get the idea that all of these things are going to array out on the back wall here. Now we can adjust this, and one of the things that we're going to experiment with this week is how to sort of create a little bit more depth, and that's going to be sort of where we set the distance point and sort of our scale and whatnot. We're going to experiment with that, and so it's not something that that I've done before in class, but I think it's going to be helpful. But get started on your projects with that in mind, just sort of choosing our our distance point based off of 45, and we'll maybe experiment with what if we use a 30-degree angle for our projections, or a 60-degree angle or something. All right, but we're going to be using our t-squares. But for this assignment, just get started with using a 45-degree angle back to your picture plane. We can maybe have a look at what happens if we move our picture plane back further on our page. How does that change our perspective? But just do one perspective layout, and I will be in to touch base with you all. Okay, so good luck with that.